Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Published in 1932, Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder is the first book in the beloved Little House series, which chronicles the pioneering experiences of the Ingalls family. Based on Wilder's own childhood memories, the novel paints a vivid picture of life on the American frontier in the late 19th century. Unlike later books in the series, which focus on the family's westward journey, Little House in the Big Woods remains rooted in a single place, a secluded log cabin in the Wisconsin wilderness, allowing readers to experience the quiet but rigorous routine of self-sufficient homesteading. Wilder's storytelling is nostalgic yet honest, capturing both the joys and hardships of frontier life. The book has been praised for its detailed descriptions of daily survival, from preserving food for winter to making homemade bullets. However, modern readers sometimes critique its portrayal of Native Americans and 19th century social norms, which reflect the prevailing attitudes of the time. Despite these discussions, Little House in the Big Woods remains an enduring classic, offering a glimpse into a world shaped by resilience, family bonds, and the rhythms of nature. With that, let's begin our journey into the deep Wisconsin woods, where young Laura Ingalls lived with her family in a time before roads, towns, or modern conveniences. Deep in the vast Wisconsin wilderness, where the thick trees stood like silent guardians over the land, a small log cabin nestled in a clearing was home to the Ingalls family. There were no neighbors close by, no towns within easy reach, only the big woods stretching endlessly in all directions. Here, young Laura Ingalls lived with her ma and pa, her older sister Mary, and baby Carrie. Laura's world was one of quiet simplicity, but also deep wonder. The towering trees surrounded them, their dense branches whispering in the wind, and beyond them lay a world she could only imagine. To Laura, the big woods were both comforting and mysterious, a place where wild animals roamed freely, where the seasons ruled their daily lives, and where survival depended on the hard work of her family. Inside their sturdy cabin, life followed a steady rhythm, dictated by nature's cycles. The walls of their home were built from logs Pa had carefully cut and stacked, each one sealed with a mixture of mud and straw. The roof was thatched with wooden shingles, and thick slabs of bark served as insulation against the bitter cold. A single glass window, a rarity in the wilderness, allowed in slivers of light during the short winter days. Winter had set in early that year, and the landscape outside was blanketed in heavy snow. The cold was relentless, creeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. But inside, the fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth filling the small space. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the wooden floor as Laura and Mary sat beside it, listening to the soothing hum of Ma's voice while she worked. The scent of wood smoke mixed with the rich aroma of cornbread baking in the iron pot, and from the rafters above, dried herbs and smoked meat hung in neat bundles, a reminder of the hard work it took to prepare for winter. Though Laura and Mary were young, they had already learned the importance of self-sufficiency. Every summer and fall, their family worked tirelessly to store food for the long, unforgiving months ahead. The cellar beneath their cabin was packed with potatoes, turnips, and squash, carefully gathered from Ma's small garden. Large barrels held salt pork, while sacks of flour and cornmeal were stacked in the corner. Each item had been prepared and preserved with great care, ensuring they would not go hungry when the land lay frozen and barren. Pa was the provider, venturing into the woods with his long rifle slung over his shoulder. He knew every trail, every hidden path where deer grazed and wild turkeys foraged. Hunting was not just a skill, it was a necessity. Without fresh meat, the family would not survive the winter. Laura loved to watch Pa prepare for his hunting trips. He would carefully check his powder horn, making sure he had enough ammunition, then sharpen his hunting knife until its blade gleamed in the firelight. Before he left, he always reminded Laura and Mary to listen to Ma and stay close to the cabin. When Pa returned from a hunt, his arms laden with game, the real work began. Every part of the animal was used, nothing was wasted. The meat was carefully butchered and salted for storage, while the hide was stretched and dried to be made into warm clothing or sturdy moccasins. The bones were boiled down to make broth, and even the fat was rendered into soap. It was a lesson in gratitude and resourcefulness, one that Laura absorbed deeply. One of the most memorable times of the year was the pig butchering in late autumn. Pa and Uncle Henry would work together, slaughtering the animal and ensuring that nothing went to waste. The process was long and laborious, but it was also a time of gathering and shared work. The meat was carefully divided, some pieces salted and stored, while others were hung to smoke over slow, burning hickory wood. Ma worked tirelessly in the kitchen, turning the fresh scraps into delicious sausages, seasoning them with sage and pepper before stuffing them into clean casings. She made head cheese from the boiled meat and spices, carefully pressing it into a mold to set. Laura and Mary found fascination in every step, but the greatest joy of all was the pig's bladder, which, once cleaned and inflated, became a makeshift balloon. They kicked it back and forth, their laughter ringing through the cabin as they played with this unexpected toy. Despite the hard work that defined their lives, there were moments of play and happiness. In the evenings, when the day's chores were done, the family gathered by the fire. Pa would take out his fiddle, his calloused fingers dancing over the strings, filling the cabin with lively tunes. Laura's heart swelled with joy as he played, his foot tapping to the beat. He sang old folk songs passed down through generations, his deep voice weaving tales of adventure and love. Ma would sit in her rocking chair, knitting or mending clothes, her steady presence bringing a sense of peace to the home. Mary and Laura would listen with rapt attention, their imaginations running wild as Pa told stories of his own childhood, of wolves howling in the distance and nights spent under a sky full of stars. The warmth of the fire, the sound of Pa's music, and the closeness of family made these evenings some of Laura's happiest memories. But life in the big woods was not without its dangers. Wild animals lurked just beyond the clearing, hidden in the dense trees. Laura had heard Pa talk of panthers prowling the forest, their eerie cries piercing the night. Bears, too, were a constant threat. One evening, as Pa returned from the barn, he mistook a large black shape near the door for their cow, Suki. But as he reached out, he realized too late that it was a bear. Frozen with shock, he watched as the massive creature lumbered away into the night. These moments reminded Laura of the wildness of their world. The big woods was beautiful, but it was also untamed. It required respect, caution, and resilience. Every rule that Ma and Pa set for their daughters was meant to keep them safe in a place where nature ruled above all else. The changing seasons marked the passing of time, each one bringing new challenges and tasks. Spring meant planting. Summer was for harvesting. Autumn was for hunting and preserving, and winter was for surviving. The cycle repeated year after year, and with each turn, Laura grew more aware of the world around her. Though she was still a little girl, Laura's heart was filled with a longing for adventure. She often wondered what lay beyond the big woods, what kind of people lived in far-off towns, and whether she would ever see more of the world. But for now, nestled in the warmth of her home, surrounded by the flickering firelight and the soft strains of Pa's fiddle, she knew that she was safe and loved. Little did she know that one day, the big woods would be just a memory, a place she would look back on with nostalgia, long after her family had moved on to new and distant lands. For now, this was home. And in the heart of the big woods, Laura Ingalls' childhood was unfolding, one season at a time. The cold, silent winter stretched on in the big woods, wrapping the Ingalls' little cabin in an icy embrace. Snow piled high against the log walls, burying the tree stumps in the clearing and covering the trails that led deep into the forest. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue by day and a vast, star-speckled black at night. Ice crystals clung to the cabin's tiny glass window, and the wind howled through the trees like a restless spirit. But inside, the fire burned steadily, warming the family as they went about their daily lives. For Laura and Mary, winter meant long days indoors, where they helped Ma with chores and found ways to entertain themselves. Though the big woods outside were frozen and still, the little house bustled with quiet activity. The girls had learned to make themselves useful, standing on stools to help Ma with small tasks in the kitchen. They stirred thick cornmeal mush bubbling in the pot, washed wooden bowls with water warmed over the fire, and carefully set out the plates when it was time to eat. Ma was always working, her hands never idle. She sat in her rocking chair, mending clothes, knitting warm woolen mittens, or spinning yarn for new dresses. Laura loved to watch her, fascinated by the steady rhythm of the spinning wheel, the way the wool twisted into a fine thread that would soon be woven into cloth. Mary, ever the careful and obedient sister, followed Ma's instructions closely, trying her best to learn each task. Laura, however, was more restless. She longed to run outside, to race through the snowdrifts, to explore the woods beyond the clearing. But winter's bitter cold held her inside, and so she had to find her adventures within the walls of the cabin. One of the greatest joys of the season was when Pa stayed home for the day. On those evenings, when the work was done and the night stretched long ahead of them, he would take out his fiddle. The rich, warm notes filled the cabin, and Laura felt a deep happiness settle inside her. Pa played lively jigs that made her want to dance, soft melodies that made her heart ache with longing, and cheerful tunes that brought smiles to their faces. Laura and Mary sat at his feet, listening in rapture as he played and sang. His voice was strong, full of warmth and life. Sometimes, between songs, he would tell stories about his own childhood, about when he was a boy growing up in the woods of New York, before he had ever met Ma. He spoke of wolves howling outside his father's cabin, of running through the forest with his brothers, of the adventures he had before he became a husband and father himself. Laura loved these moments, not just because of the stories, but because of the way Pa made everything seem grand and exciting. To him, even the simplest things, chopping wood, hunting a deer, making a sled, were part of a grand adventure. and Laura wanted to see the world the way he did, to be brave and clever and strong, just like Pa. The days passed slowly, one blending into the next, but every so often, something special would happen to break the routine. One of those special days was when Ma decided it was time to make butter. Butter making was a long process, but Laura found it fascinating. First, Ma skimmed the thick cream off the top of the milk, carefully pouring it into the wooden churn. Then came the hard work, pushing the churn dash up and down, over and over again, until the cream thickened and clumped together. Laura and Mary took turns, though their arms quickly tired. It was slow, steady work, but when Ma finally opened the churn, the transformation was complete. The rich, golden butter sat in thick lumps, separate from the thin buttermilk that remained. Ma washed the butter in cold water, pressing and shaping it into smooth, round cakes. Then she took out a small wooden mold, carved with a delicate flower pattern, and pressed it into the butter, leaving a beautiful imprint. When the butter was set, she wrapped it in clean cloths and stored it carefully. As a reward for their help, Ma let Laura and Mary drink the leftover buttermilk, its cool, tangy taste refreshing after their hard work. It was little moments like these that made winter bearable, the special treats, the sense of accomplishment, and the knowledge that every bit of effort helped their family survive the long season. Another great delight of winter was when Ma made maple syrup candy. This was something they did only when the snow was fresh and clean, piled high outside the cabin door. Pa would bring in a pan of boiling maple syrup, its rich, sweet scent filling the air, and Ma would ladle it onto the snow in thin streams. As soon as the hot syrup hit the cold surface, it hardened into golden ribbons of candy, ready to be eaten. Laura and Mary pressed their fingers into the sticky sweetness, tasting the rich, smoky maple flavor as it melted in their mouths. It was a rare treat, something they only had in the coldest months when the sap ran thick in the maple trees. The days slowly grew longer, but winter still held its grip on the big woods. Some nights, the wind blew so fiercely that the whole cabin seemed to tremble. The trees creaked and groaned, their frozen branches swaying against the force of the storm. Inside, Laura lay curled under the thick quilt beside Mary, listening to the sounds of the night. She wasn't afraid, not really, not as long as Pa was there. She knew he would keep them safe, that the sturdy cabin walls would protect them from the cold and the darkness. But still, she wondered about the creatures outside, about the deer huddled in the trees, the wolves prowling in the shadows, and the great, silent bears that slept deep in their dens beneath the snow. One evening, Pa told them a story about a time he had seen a bear up close. He had been walking home through the woods, just as dusk was falling, when he saw a large, dark shape moving ahead of him. At first, he thought it was a stump, but as he got closer, the shape moved. It was a bear bigger than any he had ever seen, standing still as a statue. Pa had held his breath, gripping his rifle tightly, but the bear simply turned and disappeared into the trees, as silent as a shadow. Pa never fired his gun. There was no need. He had learned long ago that the wild animals of the big woods would leave you alone if you left them alone. Laura thought about that story as she drifted off to sleep, warm and safe beneath the thick quilt. She imagined the great bear, its heavy paws making no sound in the snow, its dark eyes watching from the shadows. She wondered if she would ever see one herself, if she would ever grow big and brave enough to walk through the woods alone like Pa did. But for now, she was just a little girl in the big woods, curled up in her little bed, listening to the wind outside. And as she drifted into dreams, she knew that tomorrow would bring another day of work, of play, of stories and songs by the fire. Winter was long, but inside the little house, there was warmth, love, and the quiet joy of life in the wilderness. Winter had settled deeply into the big woods, wrapping the little house in a thick, unbroken blanket of snow. The air outside was sharp and still, the only movement coming from the occasional gust of wind that sent fine, glistening ice crystals swirling through the trees. Life inside the cabin continued at a steady pace, the days marked by warmth, work, and the comfort of being together. Laura and Mary played indoors, helped Ma with chores, and listened to Pa's stories by the fire, their world safe and secure within the sturdy log walls. But the long winter also meant a special time of year had come, hog butchering time. This was one of the most important events in the household, a time when meat was prepared and stored, so the family would have enough food to last through the cold months. It was a time of hard work, but it was also full of excitement for Laura, who loved seeing Pa and Ma's skill in preparing everything with care and efficiency. On that crisp morning, Pa hitched up the sled, and with his gun slung over his shoulder, set off through the woods toward Uncle Henry's house. Uncle Henry lived not far away, and he and Pa worked together each year to butcher their hogs. The process was long and difficult, but it was necessary. Every part of the pig was used. Nothing was wasted. While Pa was gone, Ma got everything ready in the little house. She cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, laid out knives and bowls, and prepared the big iron kettle that would soon be used to render lard. Laura and Mary helped where they could, though much of the work was beyond them. They knew, however, that when Pa returned, they would get to witness something both fascinating and important, the transformation of the pig into food that would sustain their family for months. When Pa finally arrived back home, his sled was laden with fresh meat wrapped in cloth, and he carried the pig slung over his strong shoulders. The butchering work began immediately, with Pa and Ma each taking their roles. The meat was carefully cut into sections, some of which would be salted down in barrels, while others would be smoked and hung in the attic. Ma was in charge of making the sausage, a process Laura found mesmerizing. She mixed ground pork with salt, pepper, and sage, using her hands to blend everything together. Then, she stuffed the mixture into cleaned casings, forming long ropes of sausage that would be hung to cure. The rich, spicy scent of sage and pepper filled the cabin, making Laura's stomach growl. While most of the meat was being stored away, there were some parts of the pig that needed to be used right away. One of the most anticipated moments for Laura and Mary was when Ma roasted the pig's tail. It was a special treat, something that only came once a year. Ma carefully roasted it over the open fire, turning it slowly so that the skin became crisp and golden brown. When it was ready, she handed it to Laura and Mary, who took turns nibbling at it, savoring the salty, smoky flavor. But there was another prize that came from the butchering, the pig's bladder. Pa saved it, cleaned it thoroughly, and then did something that made Laura and Mary giggle with delight. He blew it up like a balloon and tied it shut with a piece of string. The bladder was light and bouncy, and the girls tossed it back and forth, laughing as it floated through the air like a real ball. It was a simple thing, but to them, it was a wonderful toy, something special that only came once a year. While the children played, Ma continued her work, rendering the fat into lard. She placed chunks of fat into the large iron kettle and melted it down over the fire. The clear, golden liquid was poured into clean jars where it would harden and be stored for cooking. The leftover crispy bits, called cracklings, were scooped out and set aside as a special snack. As the butchering process continued, Pa took some of the meat and began preparing it for smoking. He rubbed the hams and shoulders with a mixture of salt and brown sugar, coating them thoroughly before hanging them in the attic. There, they would cure slowly, their flavor deepening over time. Laura and Mary loved watching the process, though they knew better than to get too close while Ma and Pa worked. They could smell the sharp tang of salt and sugar mixed with the richness of fresh meat. It was a scent that meant security. This food would last them through the winter, ensuring that no matter how fierce the storms became, they would never go hungry. When all the work was finally done, the little house was filled with an abundance of food. The shelves were stocked with jars of lard, barrels of salted pork, and carefully hung sausages. The attic now held rows of smoked hams and shoulders, their rich, savory scent mingling with the faintest hint of wood smoke. That evening, when all the work was finished, Pa sat back in his chair and took out his fiddle. He began to play a lively tune, the music filling the warm space of the cabin. Laura and Mary clapped along, their bodies swaying to the rhythm. Even Ma smiled as she stitched by the fire, content after a long and productive day. Pa played another tune, this one slower, and Laura felt a sense of deep comfort settle over her. The world outside was dark and cold, but inside, there was warmth, safety, and the steady presence of her family. She leaned against Mary, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her sister's breathing. As the fire crackled and the music played, Laura closed her eyes, letting herself drift off into sleep, her dreams filled with images of golden cracklings, bouncing pig bladders, and the ever-present warmth of the little house in the big woods. The days continued to pass in the big woods, with the deep chill of winter settling over the land. Snow covered the ground in an unbroken sheet of white, and the trees stood still and quiet, their bare branches heavy with frost. Inside the little house, the warmth of the fire kept the family cozy, while the food they had worked so hard to prepare sustained them through the cold months. Though Laura longed to run through the grass and play in the sunshine, she found comfort in the steady rhythm of life inside the cabin. Each day brought its own set of tasks, and each task was a small part of the larger pattern that made up their world. One of the most exciting events of winter was the making of butter. Laura loved watching Ma churn the fresh cream into thick, golden butter, her strong hands working the wooden dasher up and down in the churn. The rhythmic sound filled the room as Ma patiently worked, her arms never stopping, her face calm and focused. Mary and Laura took turns watching closely, fascinated by the transformation. At first, the cream sloshed around inside the churn, its surface smooth and white. But as Ma continued her steady motion, tiny flecks of yellow began to appear, gathering together into small clumps. Soon, the buttermilk separated, leaving behind a mound of soft, golden butter. When Ma finally lifted the lid and scooped out the fresh butter, Laura could hardly contain her excitement. She helped Ma wash it in cold water, kneading and pressing it to remove any remaining buttermilk. Then Ma added a pinch of salt, working it in carefully before shaping the butter into neat, round balls. The best part, though, was when Ma let Laura and Mary each have a turn using the butter mold. The wooden mold had a carved design at the bottom, and when the butter was pressed inside and then carefully released, It came out with a beautiful pattern on top. Some days, Ma used the mold with the wheat sheaf pattern, while other times she used the one with a star. The butter was then stored in a cool place, ready to be spread on warm cornbread or melted over steaming bowls of porridge. Laura loved the rich, creamy taste, and she knew that every bite was the result of careful work and patience. Even with the cold pressing in from outside, there was always something to do in the little house. Ma spent many hours at her spinning wheel, turning soft wool into long strands of yarn. The rhythmic whirring of the wheel filled the room as she worked, her fingers moving quickly and skillfully. Laura loved watching Ma spin. The fluffy wool was twisted and pulled, becoming thinner and stronger with each pass through Ma's hands. Then, once the yarn was ready, Ma would dye it using natural colors from plants and bark. Sometimes she used brown walnut shells, and other times she boiled red sumac berries to create a deep reddish color. When the yarn was ready, Ma carefully wound it into skeins and stored it for weaving. She would use it to knit warm mittens, scarves, and stockings, ensuring that everyone in the family stayed warm through the long winter. But winter wasn't just about work. There were moments of joy and playfulness too. One of Laura's favorite things about winter was when Pa took them outside for a sleigh ride. Wrapped in thick wool blankets, Laura, Mary, and baby Carrie nestled close together as Pa hitched the horses to the sled. The runners cut smoothly through the snow, sending up a spray of white powder as they glided over the frozen ground. The cold air stung Laura's cheeks, but she didn't mind. She loved the way the horses' breath steamed in the crisp air, their strong legs kicking up flurries of snow as they trotted forward. The sleigh bells jingled merrily, their bright sound echoing through the silent woods. Sometimes, Pa would let Laura and Mary ride on his back while he ran through the snow, pretending to be a wild animal. He growled and roared, shaking them playfully as they squealed with laughter. Then he would scoop them up in his arms and twirl them around, their woolen mittens brushing against his rough beard. Evenings in the little house were filled with warmth and music. After supper, Pa often took out his fiddle and played lively tunes that made Laura want to dance. The flickering light from the fireplace cast long shadows on the log walls as Pa's music filled the room. Laura and Mary clapped along, their feet tapping against the wooden floor. Sometimes, Pa would sing, his deep voice blending with the notes of the fiddle. Other times, he played soft, slow tunes that made the house feel even cozier, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them like a blanket. When the music was done, Ma would gather Laura and Mary close and tell them stories, her voice gentle and soothing. She told them about her own childhood, about the times when she had been a little girl growing up in a cabin much like this one. As Laura listened, she felt a deep sense of belonging. She knew that she was part of something bigger than just herself. She was part of a long line of people who had worked hard, loved deeply, and built their lives in the big woods. One of the best winter nights was when they made molasses candy in the snow. Ma heated a pan of molasses and sugar over the fire, stirring it carefully until it bubbled and thickened. Then, when it was ready, she took the pan outside and poured the hot syrup onto the fresh snow. As soon as the cold air touched the syrup, it hardened into golden ribbons of candy. Laura and Mary picked up the pieces, their fingers red from the cold, and popped them into their mouths. The candy was sweet and crisp, melting slowly as they savored every bite. The days continued in this way, one flowing into the next as winter stretched on. Though Though the world outside was frozen and still, the little house was always full of life, warmth, and the steady hum of daily tasks. Laura felt safe and happy, knowing that no matter how cold it was outside, inside the little house, there was always warmth, love, and the promise of another day. The deep winter held the big woods in its icy grip, and the days inside the little house continued with their comforting routines. Laura had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life in the snowbound forest, where the howling wind outside only made the fire in the hearth feel warmer, and the flickering light of the lantern cast friendly shadows on the log walls. The days were short, with the sun setting early, and nights were long and dark. But there was always something to do. When they weren't helping Ma with chores or watching Pa whittle wooden spoons and toys by the fire, Laura and Mary found joy in the simple pleasures of their small world. One of the most exciting days of the winter was butchering day. Though Laura had seen it before, she was still fascinated by the great preparation that went into making sure the family had enough meat to last them through the harshest part of the season. Early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen, Pa hitched up the horses and drove away through the woods to Uncle Henry's house. Laura and Mary knew that their father and uncle were going to spend the entire day butchering the hogs that had been fattened throughout the summer and fall. The process was long and difficult, but necessary. Every part of the pig would be used in some way. Nothing would go to waste. The meat would be salted and stored for later. The fat would be rendered into lard. And even the pig's bladder would be cleaned and inflated like a balloon for Laura and Mary to play with, bouncing it back and forth in the small confines of the cabin. When Pa returned home late in the day, he was covered in snow, his cheeks red from the cold. He and Ma worked together, carefully cutting and preparing the fresh meat. Some of it would be hung in the smokehouse to cure, while the rest was stored for immediate use. That night, they had a great feast to celebrate. Ma fried tender pieces of fresh pork, sizzling them in the pan until they were brown and crispy. She also made delicious, rich gravy from the drippings, pouring it over mashed potatoes. The warm, hearty meal filled Laura's belly and made her feel safe and content as the wind howled outside. But the best part of the butchering was when Ma made cracklings. She took the bits of fat and fried them until they were crisp and golden, then let them cool on a plate. Laura loved the crunchy, salty taste, savoring each bite. After the meal, Pa carved thin slices of fresh meat, laying them on a pan to dry near the fire. These pieces would become jerky, a treat that would last for weeks and could be taken on long trips into the woods. Though the butchering was hard work, it meant the family would have enough food to last them through the worst of the winter. Laura felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that everything had a purpose and that nothing was wasted. As the days passed, the excitement of the butchering faded into the steady routine of winter life. Laura and Mary spent their time helping Ma with chores, listening to Pa's stories, and playing quietly with their homemade dolls and toys. Sometimes, when the work was done and the house was warm and peaceful, Ma would take out her sewing basket and teach Laura and Mary how to stitch. They practiced on small squares of cloth, carefully threading the needle and making tiny, even stitches. Though Mary was more careful and patient, Laura tried her best, determined to learn the skill. Ma explained that one day they would need to sew their own clothes and mend their own stockings, so it was important to learn now. Laura listened carefully, watching Ma's hands move smoothly over the fabric, her needle flashing in the firelight. On special days, when Pa was in a playful mood, he would tell stories of his childhood. Laura loved these moments, sitting close to him as he spoke in his deep, steady voice. He told of the time he and his brothers had gotten lost in the woods as boys, of the great bear that had once prowled near their home, and of the wild adventures he had while hunting and trapping. But Laura's favorite story was the one about Grandpa's big dance in the woods. Pa told them how, long ago, his father had invited all the neighbors to a dance in their cabin. The men had chopped wood for weeks, making sure there was plenty to keep the fire roaring through the night. Ma and the other women had cooked and baked for days, preparing a great feast. When the night of the dance arrived, people came from miles around, riding through the dark forest in their sleds. The cabin had been filled with laughter and music as Pa's father played his fiddle, and everyone danced until dawn. As Pa told the story, his eyes twinkled, and Laura could almost hear the sound of the fiddle playing in the distance. The thought of a warm, lively dance in the middle of the cold winter filled her with a sense of wonder and excitement. Pa promised that someday, when Laura and Mary were older, they would go to a dance like that too. Until then, they had their own little celebrations in the cabin, with Pa playing his fiddle and Ma singing along. The days in the big woods continued, each one bringing its own simple joys and challenges. Though the world outside was harsh and cold, inside the little house, there was always warmth, love, and the steady rhythm of family life. The long winter continued in the big woods, and while the world outside remained frozen in deep snowdrifts, life inside the little house remained busy with chores, stories, and small comforts. The days passed in a steady rhythm, each one much like the last, yet always holding a new moment of wonder for Laura as she watched and learned from her parents. One of the most important tasks of the winter was making butter. This was a job Ma took great pride in, and Laura and Mary loved to watch the process, fascinated by how a simple liquid could be transformed into something so rich and golden. Early in the morning, Ma would bring in the milk from the pans that had been left to sit overnight, allowing the cream to rise to the top. With careful hands, she skimmed off the thick, white cream and poured it into the churn. The churn was a tall wooden barrel with a long handle attached to a paddle inside. When Ma began churning, she moved the dasher up and down steadily, never stopping, until the cream thickened and turned into soft, pale butter. Sometimes, when she was in a good mood, Ma let Laura and Mary take turns churning. Laura loved the rhythmic motion of pushing the dasher up and down, though it made her arms ache after a few minutes. The steady movement was comforting, the soft splash of cream inside the churn a quiet background sound as Ma hummed a tune. After what seemed like a long time, the cream finally changed. Small yellow lumps began to form, separating from the milky buttermilk. Ma would then lift the lid and carefully scoop out the butter, rinsing it in cold water to wash away the buttermilk. Then, she shaped it into a neat, round ball and pressed it into a wooden mold to make pretty patterns on top. The finished butter was smooth and golden, with a delicate design on the surface. Ma set it on a cool shelf to harden, ready for use. The leftover buttermilk was saved for baking, and sometimes Ma even let Laura and Mary drink a cup of it, though though Laura preferred fresh milk. When the butter was done, Ma often baked fresh bread. The smell of the rising dough filled the little house, warm and comforting. Laura loved watching Ma work, her hands moving quickly as she kneaded the dough, pressing and folding it with practiced ease. While the bread baked, filling the cabin with its rich, yeasty scent, Ma prepared a special treat, maple syrup snow candy. Pa had been outside earlier that morning, checking his traps and bringing in fresh wood for the fire. But he had also gathered fresh, clean snow in a pan. Ma heated maple syrup in a small pot over the stove, stirring it carefully until it bubbled and darkened to a rich amber color. Then she carried the pan of hot syrup to the door, where she quickly drizzled it over the snow in thin, golden lines. Laura and Mary watched in delight as the syrup instantly hardened into crisp, sugary shapes. Once it was cool enough, they each took a piece, letting it melt on their tongues. The sweet taste of maple filled their mouths, a bright burst of flavor in the cold winter day. Making maple syrup candy was one of Laura's favorite winter traditions, a reminder that even in the harshest months, there were simple joys to be found. After the morning's work was done, the day settled into its usual routine. While Ma mended clothes and Pa worked on his traps, Laura and Mary played quietly by the fire. Sometimes, they helped Ma with her sewing, practicing their stitches on scraps of fabric. Other times, they listened to Pa tell stories of his childhood, his voice warm and steady in the flickering firelight. One of Laura's favorite stories was about the panther in the woods. Pa told them how, when he was a boy, his father had once walked home late at night through the forest. The trees were thick and dark, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath his boots. Suddenly, he had heard something behind him, a soft rustling in the branches. He had turned, peering into the shadows, but saw nothing. He kept walking, but the sound followed him. A low, eerie growl broke the silence, and when he turned again, he saw the panther, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Its sleek body stretched along a tree branch, waiting to pounce. Without hesitation, Grandpa had fired his gun. The sharp crack of the rifle had shattered the stillness of the night, and the panther had leapt away into the darkness. Laura shivered with excitement every time she heard the story, imagining the silent, stalking panther and the bravery of her grandfather facing the wild alone. Though the big woods were quiet now, with snow covering the ground and most of the animals in hibernation, the thought of a great, fierce creature watching from the trees always sent a thrill down Laura's spine. As the sun began to set, Ma called Laura and Mary to help set the table for supper. Tonight, they were having a simple meal of cornbread and beans, but Ma had also prepared a small dish of buttered carrots and fried potatoes. Laura loved watching Pa eat after a long day. He always took his time, savoring every bite, and when he was finished, he leaned back with a satisfied sigh. After supper, Pa took out his fiddle, tuning the strings carefully before playing a lively tune. The sound of the music filled the little house, lifting Laura's spirits as she and Mary clapped along. Pa played songs from his childhood, melodies passed down from his own father, and sometimes Ma sang softly along, her voice gentle and soothing. The music carried them through the evening, wrapping them in warmth and comfort as the wind howled outside. At last, it was time for bed. Ma helped Laura and Mary into their long nightgowns, tucking them into their trundle bed with warm quilts piled high. As she lay beside Mary, listening to the crackling fire and the soft hum of Pa's fiddle, Laura felt safe and content. Life in the big woods was simple, but every day was filled with its own quiet magic: the smell of fresh bread, the taste of maple syrup candy, the sound of Pa's stories and music. As she drifted off to sleep, Laura smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of adventure in the little house in the big woods. The days passed steadily in the little house, winter tightening its grip on the big woods. The snow outside piled higher, drifting up against the walls of the house, blanketing the land in a soft, silent stillness. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches occasionally creaking under the weight of the snow, and the world beyond the cabin seemed frozen in time. But inside, life carried on, full of warmth, work, and wonder. One morning, Laura and Mary woke to find frost on the inside of the windows, forming delicate, feathery patterns across the glass. Their breath came out in little white puffs as they sat up in bed, rubbing their eyes and pulling the quilts up to their chins. Ma was already up, tending to the fire, and Pa was dressing in his heavy coat and boots, preparing to go outside. The warmth of the fire had not yet reached the farthest corners of the cabin, and Laura could feel the chill seeping through the wooden floorboards. "You girls get dressed quickly now," Ma called, shaking out a blanket of fresh snow Pa had carried in. He always brought in a pan of clean snow for washing on particularly cold mornings, when going to the well meant facing the bitter wind. Laura and Mary scrambled to put on their warm woolen stockings and thick dresses. As soon as they were dressed, Ma called them to the stove, where she had placed a steaming bowl of porridge for each of them. The girls sat on their stools, holding the warm bowls close, grateful for the comforting heat against their fingers. While they ate, Pa pulled on his mittens and hat, took his gun, and opened the door. A sharp gust of icy wind rushed in, making Laura shiver even though she was bundled in her warmest clothes. "I'll check the traps and see about fresh meat," Pa said, stepping into the deep snow. "Be back before long." Pa had set traps some distance from the house in hopes of catching a fox or mink. The pelts could be traded in town for supplies, and any extra meat would be a welcome addition to their winter stores. While Pa was gone, Ma kept busy with her usual morning tasks. She spun wool into fine threads, mended clothes, and prepared dough for baking. The smell of rising bread filled the cabin, making Laura's stomach grumble even though she had just eaten. After breakfast, Ma set out a special treat for the girls, a bundle of soft fabric scraps. "I think it's time you learn a little more about sewing," she said with a smile. Laura's eyes lit up with excitement. She had watched Ma so many times, her fingers moving with practiced ease, stitching clothes and patching holes with careful precision. Now, at last, she and Mary would get to try for themselves. Ma showed them how to thread the needle, guiding them gently as they tried to make even stitches along the fabric. Laura's stitches were small and uneven, the thread sometimes knotting where it shouldn't, but Ma didn't scold her. Instead, she encouraged her to keep practicing, to take her time. "Every little girl must learn to sew," Ma said. "One day, you'll be making clothes for your own family." Laura felt proud, even though her stitches weren't perfect. She imagined herself one day sewing dresses as fine as Ma's, sitting by the fire on winter nights, working patiently on each little piece of fabric. While they sewed, Ma told them a story about when she was a little girl. She had grown up in a cabin much like theirs, learning the same skills she was now teaching her daughters. Laura loved these moments, listening to Ma's gentle voice, feeling connected to a past that seemed both distant and familiar. Time passed quickly, and soon they heard Pa's boots crunching in the snow outside. He stomped his feet on the doorstep, shaking off the cold before stepping inside. "Well now," he said with a wide grin, holding up a fresh rabbit. "Looks like we'll have stew tonight." Laura and Mary cheered. Rabbit stew was a special meal, rich and hearty, perfect for the cold winter days. Ma took the rabbit from Pa, setting it aside to be cleaned and cooked later. After lunch, Pa settled into his chair by the fire, stretching his legs out with a satisfied sigh. He took out his whittling knife and a small block of wood, beginning to carve as he spoke. "I think I might have a surprise for you girls before long," he said, his eyes twinkling. Laura and Mary watched eagerly as he worked, but he didn't reveal what he was making just yet. Instead, he told them another story, one about the time he had gotten lost in the woods as a boy. The trees were thick, and the snow had started falling heavy, he said, his voice low and dramatic. "I couldn't see a thing ahead of me, and I knew if I kept walking in the wrong direction, I might never find my way home." Laura shivered, imagining Pa as a small boy, alone in the vast, dark forest. But then, Pa continued, "I heard a sound, the hoot of an owl. I knew that owls like to sit in the high branches near clearings, and if there was a clearing, I might be able to get my bearings. So I followed the sound, step by step, through the snow, until at last I saw the open sky, and just beyond the clearing, I found my way home." Laura let out a breath, relieved at the happy ending. She loved Pa's stories, the way they made her feel as though she were right there, living through the adventure. As the afternoon passed, Ma worked on preparing supper, while Laura and Mary helped where they could. They peeled potatoes, stirred the pot of stew, and set the table with care. The smell of cooking meat and fresh bread made the little house feel even cozier. At last, the meal was ready. They all gathered around the table, bowing their heads as Pa said grace. The rabbit stew was warm and filling, the bread soft and fresh. Laura savored each bite, feeling grateful for the food, for the warmth of the fire, and for the love of her family. After supper, Pa picked up his fiddle, playing a cheerful tune that made Laura want to dance. She and Mary clapped along, their feet tapping against the wooden floor. The music filled the cabin, pushing away the cold and darkness outside, wrapping them all in its warmth. As the evening wore on, Ma brought out her knitting, working quietly by the fire as Pa played one last soft, sweet tune. The girls yawned, their eyes growing heavy with sleep. At last, it was time for bed. Laura and Mary crawled under the quilts, their little hands still warm from the heat of the fire. "Good night, my girls," Pa said softly, tucking them in. "Good night, Pa," Laura murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She listened to the quiet crackling of the fire, feeling safe and content in the little house in the big woods. Tomorrow would bring another day, another adventure, another lesson to learn. But for now, she let herself drift off into dreams, wrapped in the warmth of her home and family. The long winter days slowly blended together, each one filled with the steady rhythm of work and play inside the snug little house. Outside, the world was buried deep under layers of snow, and the wind howled through the big woods, rattling the branches of the great trees. But inside, the fire burned warm and bright, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. One morning, Laura awoke to the sound of the wind whistling around the house. She burrowed deeper under the thick quilt, reluctant to leave the warmth of her bed. But soon, Ma's cheerful voice called to her and Mary. "Time to get up, girls," Ma said. "There's work to be done." Laura sighed, pushing back the covers and sitting up. The cabin was cold in the morning before the fire had a chance to warm the air, and she shivered as she quickly pulled on her warm wool stockings and thick dress. By the time she reached the table, Ma had already set out their breakfast, steaming bowls of porridge with a bit of molasses drizzled on top. Laura took her wooden spoon and stirred the thick, creamy porridge, watching the golden molasses swirl through it. As they ate, Pa finished pulling on his heavy coat, preparing to go outside. "There's plenty of snow out there," he said, fastening his belt. "Might be a good day for a little fun." Laura's eyes lit up with excitement. Fun in the snow. That was something to look forward to. After breakfast, she and Mary hurried to help Ma with their morning chores. They cleared the table, helped Ma sweep the floor, and even took turns kneading the dough Ma had set out to rise earlier that morning. When the work was done, they eagerly pulled on their thickest woolen mittens and warm shawls. Ma wrapped them up tightly before letting them step outside into the glittering white world. The moment Laura's boots crunched into the snow, she felt a surge of excitement. The air was crisp and cold, the sky a bright blue above the treetops. The snow stretched in every direction, untouched except for the little path Pa had cleared earlier that morning. Pa was already outside, standing near a tall snowbank. He had his arms crossed and a playful smile on his face. "Girls," he said, "have you ever seen a real snow fort?" Laura and Mary gasped with delight as Pa began shaping the snow, packing it down firmly to build a thick wall. "Come help me now," he said, beckoning them closer. They didn't need to be told twice. They rushed forward, scooping up handfuls of snow and pressing them into place. It was cold against their mittens, but they hardly noticed. Working together, they built the walls higher and higher until the little fort stood almost as tall as Laura. "Now for the finishing touch," Pa said. He took a large piece of wood from the shed and carefully placed it across the top, making a small roof. There, a perfect fort. Laura stepped inside and giggled. It really was like a tiny house made of snow. She peeked out from behind the wall, her cheeks pink with excitement. Mary joined her inside, and Pa chuckled. "Looks like I've got 2 little bears in a snow cave," he said. Then, without warning, he scooped up a handful of snow and tossed it gently into the air. Snowball fight. Laura shrieked with laughter, ducking behind the snow fort as Pa playfully lobbed another snowball in their direction. Mary giggled, scooping up her own handful of snow and shaping it into a ball. Soon, the air was full of flying snow. Laura and Mary threw their little snowballs at Pa, who dodged and laughed as he playfully tossed some back. The cold, fluffy snow scattered everywhere, making them all laugh harder. After a while, Pa held up his hands in surrender. All right, he said. "You 2 win this time," Laura beamed, her breath coming out in little white clouds. Her hands and nose were cold, but she was too happy to care. "Come inside now, girls," Ma called from the door. "Time to warm up." They hurried inside, stamping the snow off their boots and shaking off the clumps that clung to their mittens. Ma had already set a pot of warm milk on the stove, and the cozy smell of fresh bread filled the cabin. Pa ruffled Laura's hair as he hung up his coat. "That was good fun," he said. Laura couldn't stop smiling. It had been the best morning she could remember. As the day went on, they settled back into their usual routine. Ma showed them how to shape the risen bread dough into neat little loaves, and Laura loved the feeling of the soft dough under her hands. The loaves baked slowly in the oven, filling the cabin with their warm, comforting scent. Later that afternoon, Pa took out his fiddle and played a lively tune. Laura and Mary clapped along, their feet tapping against the wooden floor. The cheerful music filled the house, making even the coldest winter day feel warm. When it was time for supper, Ma set the fresh bread on the table, along with a steaming pot of stew. The warm meal felt especially good after their time in the snow, and Laura savored every bite. After supper, Pa leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. "Well now," he said, "I think this has been a fine day." Laura nodded, her heart full of happiness. The snow fort, the laughter, the warmth of their little house, it was all perfect. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Ma took out her knitting, and Pa played one last gentle tune on his fiddle. The soft music filled the room, wrapping them all in a peaceful, sleepy warmth. Laura curled up under her quilt that night, feeling safe and content. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about the snow fort, the snowball fight, and the way the world outside had sparkled so beautifully under the bright winter sun. She loved the big woods in every season, but there was something magical about winter, something that made her feel warm, even when the world outside was frozen. The long winter days continued, each one bringing its own rhythm of work and small joys. Snow still lay thick on the ground, but inside the little house, life remained warm and steady. The fire in the hearth burned bright, crackling cheerfully as Ma and the girls went about their daily chores. Laura had grown used to the quiet of winter, with Pa often outside checking the traps, and Ma busy with sewing or baking. The days felt calm, almost dreamlike. She loved watching the way the frost painted delicate, feathery patterns on the window panes, the way the snow outside shimmered in the weak winter sunlight. One morning, after breakfast, Pa bundled himself up in his thickest coat and took his rifle down from its peg. "I'm going to check the traps," he told Ma, fastening his belt. "I'll be back before supper." Laura watched eagerly as Pa laced up his boots. She always wondered what it was like, walking deep into the snowy woods, following the little trails of animals. Pa kissed Ma on the cheek, ruffled Laura and Mary's hair, and stepped outside. The cold wind rushed in as he opened the door, but the house was warm again once he shut it behind him. Laura and Mary helped Ma with the dishes, carefully wiping each wooden plate and setting it in its proper place. Then they swept the floor, brushing away the bits of flour that had fallen while Ma baked their morning bread. After the chores were done, Ma set up her sewing basket near the fire and took out a piece of blue cloth. "Would you girls like to help me sew?" she asked with a smile. Mary nodded eagerly, and Laura quickly sat beside her, watching as Ma threaded her needle. "Now, be careful," Ma reminded them. "Sewing takes patience." Laura picked up her own small piece of cloth and tried to stitch just as Ma showed her. She had to be careful not to pull the thread too tight, or the fabric would pucker. But if she left it too loose, the stitches wouldn't hold. Mary's stitches were small and even, while Laura's were a little crooked. She frowned, determined to make them better. For a long time, they sewed quietly, the only sounds in the house being the soft clicking of Ma's needle and the occasional snap of the fire. Then, all at once, the silence was broken by a distant, low howling. Laura's hands froze over her sewing. She glanced at Ma, whose lips had pressed together into a thin line. The howling came again, drifting through the trees outside. It was a lonely, eerie sound that made Laura's skin prickle. Wolves. She had heard Pa talk about them before, but she had never heard them so close. Mary's eyes widened, and she looked at Ma for reassurance. Ma's voice was steady but quiet. "It's all right, girls," she said. "We're safe inside." Still, Laura couldn't help but shiver. She imagined the wolves moving through the snowy woods, their sharp eyes glinting, their fur bristling against the cold. The howling faded, swallowed by the wind, and Ma continued her sewing as if nothing had happened. "Keep stitching, Laura," she said gently. Laura forced herself to look down at her sewing, though her heart still beat a little fast. She kept working, slowly and carefully, her fingers steadying with each stitch. By the time the afternoon sun began to sink, turning the sky a pale shade of pink, Ma had put away their sewing and was rolling out dough for supper. "Let's make some biscuits," she said, smiling at the girls. Laura loved helping Ma bake. She pressed her little fingers into the soft dough, watching as Ma cut the biscuits into neat, round shapes. The oven warmed the cabin even more, and soon the smell of fresh bread filled the room, chasing away the lingering chill of the afternoon. Just as Ma was setting the biscuits in the oven, they heard footsteps outside, heavy boots crunching through the snow. Laura's heart leaped. Pa's home. The door swung open, and there stood Pa, his face ruddy from the cold, his beard dusted with frost. He shook off the snow from his coat and stomped his boots before stepping inside. "Phew, it's cold out there," he said, rubbing his hands together. Ma hurried to take his coat, and Laura and Mary ran up to him, eager to hear about his day. Pa smiled down at them, his eyes twinkling. "I've got something to show you," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of small, shining objects. Laura gasped. Nuts. Hickory nuts and walnuts, still in their shells, gleamed in Pa's palm. "I found a squirrel's hoard," he explained, chuckling. "Looks like he had plenty stored up for winter, but I thought we could spare a few for ourselves." Laura clapped her hands. She loved the taste of hickory nuts, sweet and crunchy. Ma smiled and took them, setting them in a small bowl by the fire to dry. As Pa sat down in his chair, Ma handed him a steaming plate of biscuits and fresh butter. They ate supper together, warm and happy in the cozy little house. The wolves had long since gone quiet, and outside, the snow lay undisturbed under the soft glow of the moon. After supper, Pa took out his fiddle. Laura always loved this part of the day, the time when the work was done, and they could just sit together, listening to Pa play. The fire crackled, throwing golden light across the room as Pa tuned the strings. Then he began to play, the familiar, lilting notes filling the cabin with warmth and music. Laura closed her eyes, letting the sound wrap around her. It was a song she had heard many times before, a tune that reminded her of home, of safety, of the love that filled their little house in the big woods. As the music played on, Laura felt sleep creeping up on her. She snuggled close to Mary, wrapped in the comfort of their soft quilt, and let her eyes drift shut. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the gentle sound of Pa's fiddle, carrying her into sweet dreams of warm summer days, golden fields, and the endless, comforting embrace of her family. As winter lingered in the big woods, the days grew longer, but the world outside remained frozen in a deep hush. Snow still covered the ground in thick drifts, and ice clung to the edges of the creek. But inside the little house, Life continued in its steady rhythm, warm, busy, and full of small joys. One morning, Laura woke to a faint golden light filtering through the frost-covered window. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and stretched beneath the quilt, listening. The house was quiet except for the soft crackling of the dying embers in the hearth. Then she heard it, Pa whistling as he pulled on his boots. Laura quickly sat up, excitement fluttering in her chest. She knew what that meant. It was time for another trip into the woods. By the time she scrambled out of bed, Ma was already up, helping Mary with her braids. Carrie was still asleep, bundled up beneath the covers. Pa smiled as Laura ran over to him. "Would you like to come check the traps with me today, Half Pint?" "Oh yes, Pa," Laura said eagerly, her breath misting in the cold air. She hurried to get dressed, pulling on her warmest wool dress and wrapping herself in her thickest shawl. Ma buttoned her coat for her and handed her mittens before giving Pa a firm look. "Keep her close," she said. Pa chuckled. "Don't worry, Caroline, we'll be back before you know it." The cold air rushed over Laura as they stepped outside, but she didn't mind. She loved the sharp, crisp smell of the snow and the way the winter sun made the world sparkle like a fairyland. Pa led the way into the trees, his long strides making deep tracks in the snow. Laura followed behind, stepping carefully in his footprints. The forest was still and quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots and the occasional rustle of a squirrel high in the branches. Pa checked each trap, brushing away the snow. Some were empty, but in one, they found a rabbit caught in the snare. Pa quickly removed it, murmuring a quiet thanks to the forest. "We'll have a fine supper tonight," he said, slipping the rabbit into his bag. Laura didn't mind the cold or the long walk. She loved being out here with Pa, just the two of them, walking through the endless white woods. They didn't speak much as they walked back home, but Laura didn't need to. The peaceful silence of the woods, the steady sound of Pa's boots crunching in the snow, it all made her feel warm inside. When they reached the little house, Ma was already stirring the pot over the fire. "Welcome home," she said with a smile. "Did you have a good walk?" Laura nodded, cheeks red from the cold. Pa caught a rabbit. "That'll make a fine stew," Ma said, taking the rabbit from Pa and setting to work. The rest of the day passed in warm, comfortable busyness. Ma prepared the stew, Mary helped churn the butter, and Laura worked on sewing a small handkerchief with Ma's scraps of fabric. As the stew simmered, the house filled with its rich, savory smell. Pa sat by the fire, whittling a small piece of wood, and Carrie played with her corncob doll. By the time supper was ready, night had fallen outside. The stew was warm and delicious, and they all ate until their bellies were full. After supper, Pa leaned back in his chair, stretching well. "I do believe spring is coming," he said with a grin. Laura's heart leaped really. Pa nodded. "The sun is setting later, and I saw a few rabbit tracks that weren't covered in snow. That means the wind isn't blowing fresh snow over them so quickly. The air smells different too. You'll see, soon enough." Laura couldn't help but smile. Spring, that meant green grass, warm breezes, and flowers blooming in the woods. It also meant Pa would be plowing the fields, and they would be planting crops that night. As Pa played his fiddle, Laura closed her eyes and listened to the soft, lilting melody. She thought of the warm spring days ahead, of running barefoot in the grass, of playing with Mary under the budding trees. She was warm and safe, tucked in the little house in the big woods end as she drifted into sleep. She knew that no matter what the seasons brought, as long as they were together, they would always be home.